Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the midweek program here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. My name is William. I am an education intern here at the Arboretum for the summer, and we are in the very beautiful fantasy circle, joined with the one and only Blake for our presentation on Bonsai's Part 2. Again, thank you guys for joining us. If you are joining us on YouTube, please remember to like, subscribe, leave a comment, let us know all the wonderful things you learn. And if you got any questions in the Zoom today, just drop it in the chat and we will get to it at the end. And if you're ready, Blake, I'll hand it over to you.
Perfect. I'll take it from you, William.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for those announcements and introductions. You are truly a treasure here. We are grateful to have you here. Alrighty, so today we are doing a program on bonsai for the midweek program. Those of you may not be familiar, but I did a program back in November about bonsai. I was kind of wrangled into doing a program at the last minute because we just needed a topic, and I was able to pull that out of my hat. But I wasn't able to cover everything that I wanted to cover during that talk, so we are having a part 2 today. And so to start out our part 2 on bonsai today, I just wanted to start off with this tree in front of me here. Now, this is Lagerstromia farii. This is the straight species, and would you believe it, this particular tree was a cutting that I took off of that particular tree in the summer of 2017. So here we are in the summer of 2024, making this about 7 years old now, and I've got quite a bit of growth on it. Not as much growth as I would like. You see, I guess it was 2 years ago, I really should have repotted it, and I didn't because life is hilarious. And then the following spring, it was in desperate need of repotting, and so I did repot it then, but I really probably should have repotted it a year before, and it did not like the stress that it had been under from me waiting to repot it and then repotting it. And I will tell you, this tree last year did not leaf out until July 8th, which was terrifying. All spring long, watching it just sitting there in its pot, completely devoid of leaves. I would scratch the bark to see if it was green underneath periodically, and every time it was still alive. And it's like, I don't know what's happening with this. I'm just gonna let it be, let it go. If it sprouts, it sprouts. If it doesn't, it had a good run. And honestly, it sprouted July the 8th, and then it did not have much of a growing season then. It didn't have all year long to develop, to photosynthesize and make carbohydrates, stored energy for it to grow. So this spring, it did leaf out again in April. It leafed out in April, so we're back on schedule. It is recovering for sure, but you'll notice there was quite a bit of dieback in here from, it had to expend all its energy last year. There's quite a bit of dieback. I did prune off a whole bunch of the dieback at the beginning of the year. But the point of this tree here now is I am not touching this tree. I'm not pruning this tree. This tree was very well stressed, and in order for it to regain its health, I am just letting it be. There's something fun here. You may notice these here. These are flower buds, indeed. Now, flower buds are a big energy sink on plants, and as much as I would love to have I know you guys are already anticipating what's coming. I need to help this tree out, and flower buds are a big energy sink. But so before we get into that, William, would you be so kind as to share a photo of this tree last year when it was in flower?
I would love to.
This thing does flower, and it is beautiful in flower, and I am so grateful when it does flower. But again, like, for the sake of the tree here today, I need to get rid of these flowers, and that is basically the only work I'm going to do on this tree this year. So I will take my scissors here. I will come in. Oh boy, this is gonna make your soul cry, I know, but there it goes. Oop, snip, okay. I know. You can just leave comments in the video below and tell me how awful I am for doing this, but it really is for the benefit of the tree. Like, this tree is obviously special to me because I took it as a cutting when I was an intern here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum. And so right now, keeping this thing alive is way more important than having it look nice. Also, all of the stress that it's gone under, all of the dieback that it's having to do, that's just going to add to the character of the tree over time. So at some point, I'm gonna come in here and remove all this dead, and then there will eventually be healing involved, and there will be scars, and it will add to the character. It will make it a much more interesting tree, and that's something to look forward to. But right here, right now, I just need to let it be happy and healthy, and so that's all I'm doing with it here today. But I do have another crepe myrtle here that does want to be pruned. This particular tree came from our free plant giveaway that we have here at the J.C. Raulston Arboretum, not this last October, but the October before that. And I think this guy was in maybe like a 3-gallon pot when I got it. I just overwintered it in the 3-gallon pot and then put it in this pot that following spring. And I've just been doing clip and grow on it, which is exactly what it sounds like. Whenever it grows out, you just clip it back, you let it grow out, you clip it back. It takes time to do it that way, and it's it creates a different character with the shape of the branches than if you were to let this thing grow out and then wire it in an interesting way. I don't remember why I wanted to do clip and grow on this particular tree rather than wire. I feel like in the past, my experience with crepe myrtles is they only really like being wired with the fresh growth. Once it gets to a certain age, it really resists wiring. So I felt like maybe just clip and grow was the way to go. And so that is the way that I am going with this. And so I just want to give you some tips and pointers for pruning bonsai trees, because there are some things you want to consider when pruning bonsai trees. First and foremost, you need to determine where the top of the tree is, what your leader will be, your apex of your tree. If I'm not mistaken, I've got, boy howdy, I'm pretty sure this in here is my apex, and this thing coming off here actually needs to come down quite a bit. So really, I've got these set as the top, and I'll just go ahead and arbitrarily, this guy here. Wait. Yes. Can you twist a little bit here if you've got a leader that's right in the shot? Leader that's right in the shot. Well, it's always going to be right in the shot. So here's what we're going to do. This whole thing, I don't need this. I'll just cut this back to a single node. That's really the gist of it, honestly. Any new growth, you cut it back to 1 or 2 nodes, and that's that. But now that we've got that out of the way, we can see a little better. I'll cut, oops, and then I'm just going to be covering up everything, aren't I? But I'll just cut that. And so it was this guy, this guy in here is going to be the top of my tree. So everything else needs to be lower. So I'm just going to cut it back to a node, cut it back to a node, and then I'm just going to do this for everything that's grown out. And I can really just kind of, I don't know how to explain this, but you want it to be lower. You got to think about the light. If you've got branches growing up, they're shading everything down below. So that's first and foremost what you're thinking about. Like, oh boy, okay. So like this branch here, it's kind of hard to see, but it's not coming out super far. So while I said cut it back to 1 or 2 branches, if I cut it back to 1 or 2 leaves there, it'll be too far inside and then it will be shading. So this one I'm going to come out to about here, because I can see, from my perspective, I can see it. So I know that if the sun were here, the sun can reach that leaf and it's not being shaded out and it's golden. And then really I could just go through everything else. I'm gonna go with this guy quicker for the sake of time. Just kind of get things out of the way. This is selective pruning. The fun thing with bonsai is every cut you do in bonsai is selective. So you go in and it's an individual branch. You do not take shears to these things. That's called topiary. If you want to do topiary, follow your heart. Go for it. By all means, I don't want to stop you from getting creative with plants, but it does take a little bit of time, a little bit of thought, And again, most of the thought is just pretend you're the sun. And if you can see the leaf, then the sun can see the leaf. And if the sun can see the leaf, then your leaf is good to go. But the whole point of pruning these things out is to open it up for more light, more airflow. That way it can be a happy and healthy tree. Like the point of bonsai is not to, you know, make them suffer. It's not to bring them in. It's not to inflict pain on them. We're doing this to emphasize the goodness in them. It's all for their benefit. Even if you're wiring it, twisting it, contorting it, if you're doing all that, you should be doing it for the sake of the tree. It should not have anything to do with how cool you think it looks or how amazing you are because you're a bonsai artist. No, 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 no. This has nothing to do with you. It has everything to do with the tree. Everything you should do with this should be considered for that. And honestly, this is fine. I like this. This is a little sweetie. I'm just gonna put it at home and let it grow some more. I could prune it a little bit harder. I don't want to think about that right now. I feel good about this. That's another thing with bonsai. A lot of it's, you got to teach yourself how to feel it, but once you feel it, you feel it. And I'm feeling this right now. I'm feeling good about this. And again, this has only been in training for about 2 years now, and that's great. I like how much development I've got. I like how healthy this is. This particular cultivar, I have no idea what the name of it is, but I know that it has white flowers. And so when it gets to a point, oh boy, when it gets to a point where it can flower, the issue is if I had let all those shoots grow out, they would flower at the end of those really super long shoots, but we don't want that. The more you prune them back, the shorter the shoots are that regrow, and then the smaller the leaves too. So like you basically, by doing the clip and grow, you develop the character, you develop the maturity of all the branches so that eventually it does get to a point where it flowers. Like you guys saw the picture of the crepe myrtle in full flower. That was after, you know, 5 successive years of good pruning on it. And then it was stressed. And now I'm kind of restarting with more juvenile growth. But that's the way it goes. That's the way it goes. That is life for you. Again, I quoted Robert Burns in the last one, the best laid schemes of mice and men gang after glay. And that is still very true. As much as you would like things to go the way you want them to go, sometimes nature has other plans, and that's okay, because nature's plans are usually pretty brilliant. Okay, but so that was a crepe myrtle. That's fun. This guy you may recognize from part 1 of our bonsai program. This was the tree that we potted up back in November. As you can see, it is happy, it is healthy, it has grown this year. Here's new growth on it here. This guy here is the new growth. And then all this here, all the longer stuff down below it, that is last year's growth. Now, I'm gonna show you how to prune this pine. Pines are a little bit trickier than other, well, like broadleaves. Like I said, you don't wanna shear them like you could theoretically shear broadleaves. You could shear pines too if they're in the ground. And that's maybe another point I want to make here and now. Part of the reason I brought a tree that was weak and did practically nothing to it, and then a tree that's more vigorous and hit it more vigorous. I've learned over the years, when it comes to bonsai, it's not a question of, can you prune maples this way? It's more like, can you prune this maple this way? It's like, I will show you later, I will defoliate a maple completely, and I will say if the tree is healthy, you can defoliate a maple completely. If the tree is not healthy, don't defoliate the maple completely. It'll be a theme. We'll go through it. But this guy here, it's grown all winter long. It's got new growth on it. The old growth is still vigorous and ready to go. So I will show you how to prune pine. This is Japanese black pine, Pinus thunbergii. So the way this goes, these candles, this is June. This is the time of year that in the spring, the candles start growing and then they start to open up here in June. And once they're open, you can prune them for bonsai. And the way you do this, you take all of New Year's growth, you come into the base of the New Year's growth. You see how it's green up here and down there it's brown. That's where it changes. And so I'm just gonna cut it right here on the new growth, and the new growth is off. And so now we have last year's growth, and I'm going to pluck all of them off except for a whorl of 5 needles up around the top. Now, underneath every single needle of a pine tree is a bud. So I know this can be terrifying to pull off all of the needles of a tree, and you're like, well, what's gonna happen? Is it gonna be okay? It will be okay. I don't have pictures of one of these reflushing, but I can put it in the recording. But see, you strip off all of last year's growth and you just leave a whorl. That's even more than I needed to leave. And just to prove that I'm no coward, we're gonna, there it is. We're leaving 5. And honestly, you want to take off 5 because the point is letting in light, letting in air. If you leave more than you need, you're hurting the tree. It's too clustered in there. It can contribute to foliar diseases. It can shade out the rest of it. Honestly, you want to clean it up. Okay, and so I'm just gonna go through and chug along with this. Well, multitasking is not always the easiest thing, for sure. And it requires some amount of focus, not too much focus. Maybe I won't do this whole thing here today. I really want to though, because it really does. It's really nice to see. And there are some places where it maybe didn't grow as much as you would like. That's okay. Again, I feel like this tree, the reason I picked this tree back in November to show you guys to repot was because it was so vigorous, and it is rather vigorous still. So I feel pretty good about continuing to just great. And I personally like to make a point not to cut a needle halfway through it. If you take a needle and cut it halfway through, it'll stay on the tree, like it'll be fine, but it develops these brown little tips up at the end, which I find unattractive. I certainly have seen some bonsai artists will say that you can like take the needles and like cut them like that to make them appear shorter. And they say that by doing that, it encourages the tree to produce shorter growth when it flushes out. And I don't know how true that is, but the fact is, if you cut the needle in half, it leaves the little brown tips. So I don't like leaving little brown tips. So I don't do that. All right, and then here, I'm just gonna plow through and thin out needles. Boy, I'm telling you, doing this in Takamatsu, where all you're doing all day long is just this, you really get into a groove with it. You really get moving with it. Here today, I'm just doing my darndest to get through it, just because I want you guys to see how much foliage you cut off. And again, this is all for the sake of the health of the tree. Oh boy, I missed that, and I just pinched it off with my fingers because I don't care. It's fine. You know, nature does prune trees periodically by having animals rub up against them, break things off. Maybe a branch falls and causes other things to fall off. So there are, nature's not out there using super sharp scissors, being real careful with it. So you are forgiven if you find yourself being a little rougher with it. Okay, and I did miss this guy. I'll cut that, that's fine. Hey, William, if anybody has any questions already, we can...
Yeah.
Yeah, what are they asking?
Let's see, referring to your second plant.
Yeah.
On shaping and pruning, do you have any advice on the timing to do that?
So this is the first this year that I've done any shaping and pruning. I'm here in June, and this is, you've given the tree enough time to leaf out and grow a little bit and let that new growth kind of settle in and mature ever so slightly. And I would say June is about as early in the growing season as you want to do any pruning whatsoever. After that, you kind of just like look at the tree and then go from there. Like some are gonna be vigorous, some are gonna do like a ridiculous whole flush of growth, and you maybe you prune it again next month, really. Or maybe it doesn't go much at all, and you really just gotta kind of play it by ear. The trees always tell you what they want. by like how they are at any given point. So if it's extra vigorous, if it's growing a lot, then like go ahead and prune it. If it's struggling, then you can kind of chill with it a little bit. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, and then referring again to that, or to your crepe myrtles, do you overwinter them in a greenhouse? Jared here is telling us that he thinks about a zone 7 plant might not handle the cold weather, especially when it is in a pot in this area. He has some azaleas that he hasn't tried to bonsai yet, and he's in zone 6.
Okay, in zone 6, cool beans. Well, so certainly overwintering is something to consider. North Carolina, I personally don't do too much overwintering. I leave my plants where they are, just in my front yard. I will cluster pots together so they huddle together for warmth, but for the most part, I don't worry too much about overwintering because of where I live. If you're living further north in zone 6, for example, then you need to consider it. Part of what bonsai teaches you is to just be like mindful of what the weather is doing always, what it has been doing for like the past week or so, what it's going to be doing soon. So when it comes to overwintering, I'm thinking about, has it rained recently? Because if it hasn't rained recently, you're going to get a hard freeze. That's going to damage the tree. You'd never want a bonsai tree to freeze dry. So if you're about to get a really big freeze and it's been a while since it's rained, you want to water them. And there's also energy stored in the water that can help keep the tree going through really cold temperatures. But so it's something to consider. If you've only got a handful of trees, it's easy enough to just bring them in overnight. A good place to store bonsai trees, if you're not going to be shuffling them in back and forth, is just like in a garage. You could just have them be in an unheated garage over the entire winter and have no issues with that. It's something to be mindful of, but it's also not something you need to think too terribly hard about. Yeah, for sure. We can maybe get into that a little more later. But right now, this tree, actually, I could, if I wasn't in a rush, I'd actually make this a lot more, I'd take off a lot more needles than this, but this definitely suffices for now. There's lots of openness. The sun can see in, and presumably by leaving the 5 little needles at the top, or maybe even more, you'll get 5 new buds coming from the top, and it'll just kind of erupt like that. And then I guess in like September or something, you can kind of thin those out and like make sure there's room for more growth. You really only want to have 2 branches at any branching point. Anytime there's a branching point, you only want 2 branches. Sometimes the tree will sprout 3, sometimes it'll be 4, and a lot of beginner bonsai artists will look at those 3 or 4 branches coming out of a single point and be like, oh, that's great, because if one of those branches dies, then I've got these other ones here to pick up the slack. And the issue with that thinking, that is a self-fulfilling prophecy, if you are familiar with the term. Like, with all of those branches clustered together, that's going to make it more likely that one of those branches is going to die. If you've only got 2 branches there, you don't have to worry about one getting shaded out. You don't have to worry about fungal growth. You don't have to worry about the trees just saying, hey, I got too many branches here, I'm just going to kill one of them. Like, you'll have what you need for it. And that leads us into wiring our bonsai trees. Okay, so this is kind of a weird thing to point out, but so if you have more than 2 branches coming out of a single branching point, that also limits your ability to wire the tree. It's hard because, see, the thing is that wire only has 2 ends. And so if you've got 3 branches, you're going to have to use more than 1 piece of wire. For the sake of efficiency with wiring and just getting it right and proper, 2 branches is the way to go. And like, you may think again, oh, I want many branches coming out of a single place so that I have more options for like styling and where the branch is going to go. Again, like, no, you don't. You have infinite options because of the wire. If you have 2 branches and you have them wired, you can arrange them in literally any configuration whatsoever. You don't need extras, and extras will just kind of hinder the tree in the long term, really. But so this tree here is a sweet little pine that I love immensely. I love the shape of it. It's coming together quite nicely. However, I wouldn't necessarily say it's the most vigorous of plants. This new growth it's very healthy and it's very small, but you can like barely differentiate between, say, like the new growth. This here's new growth, these here are last year's growth. And I don't feel super good about cutting off the new growth on this one and expecting it to flush. So again, this one I would consider like borderline weak. I'm gonna let it grow a little bit. Rather than pruning it, I'm going to wire it. And I will say, I feel like wiring it is as much of a stress on the tree as pruning. I feel like if I pruned this and wired it, that would be way too much. But if I'm just wiring it, that's a little bit of stress, but because I'm doing it I'm gonna be moving the branches around so that they get more light, I feel like it's appropriate here in this instance. Now, the way you wire a tree, you can see this black wire coming up. I've already gone ahead and got it started on a bunch of them. So that black wire, that is the parent wire. That parent wire provides structure for all of the wire that goes on all of the branches. Maybe like 2 or 3 years ago, I wired up the trunk of this tree and bent it. So like, if I wanted to bend the trunk more, I guess this thing's of a certain size that I could bend the trunk more, but I'm not interested in bending the trunk more. Right now, the trunk is where I need it to be. I'm happy with it. If I used a thicker gauge of wire as this parent wire, I could presumably bend it more, but I'm not doing that. This is just for structure for the other wire. So when you're wiring branches of a bonsai tree, you wire 2 branches together always, and you do it formulaically, systematically. You're gonna wire the lowest branch to the second lowest branch, and then you're gonna wire the 3rd branch to the 4th branch. And I will say in here, I'm a little bit clustered in here. I want to remove some of these branches because I got a little bit too much going here. Now, where you put your branches on your tree, again, it needs to be able to see the sun. So you've got your wire in your trunk and you'll have points where the wire, sorry, Alexander, where the wire is sticking out. So like here, this is a very good place for this branch because there's a bent in the tree and it can just kind of shoot out from the tree. And then you can see it's at a nice height up. It's in a good place. That's great, okay? And then I'll put this down. I like this branch here. That's lovely. But in here, there's way too much. And I had considered which ones I'm gonna do. And I chose this one because it's further away from this one. This is fine. I'm going to cut this branch because it's maybe just a little bit too close to this one and it's not doing the tree any favors. So I'm just going to go in and boop. There you go. Thank you, little one. And then this guy next door is kind of in the same boat. He's too close to the one that I want to keep. So I'm just clipping him out and that's good. This guy, I am not too sure of its longevity. Ideally, it'll live. I don't know if it's going to, but I'm just going to go ahead and wire it anyway. We are entitled to our actions. We are not entitled to the fruits of our actions. Okay. And so also, all right, so with this lower branch, I told you we want to have 2 branching places at 2 branches at a single branching point. And there is another issue here with this branch. I've got this one little thing kind of growing up. It's growing up and it's above everything else. Now I could wire it and move it, but again, there's plenty of other branches in there. So honestly, I am taking this guy and I am cutting it off. Okay, so now this branch is more or less ready to be wired. So I'm gonna go in here. I don't know how you're gonna be able to see this because I kind of gotta move it in such a way that I can move it. Here, I'll do this. And then I'll just kind of wrap it around here. And I've chosen this gauge of copper wire because it feels correct. If you bend wire, it has a certain amount of resistance, and if you then bend the branch, you want the resistance in the wire to be about the same as the resistance in the branch. And so I've already gone ahead and figured that this gauge of wire should be appropriate for this size of tree. Okay. Alrighty. And then I wrap it at a 45-degree angle, and then I'm just going to put a little lip on it there, just so that it can move around. That's wonderful. There are other branches on here that I want to wire as well, and so I can do that by coming underneath the little branching point. And the goal is to not cross any branches, or not cross wire with wire is the goal. And I'm just gonna take this, I'm gonna move that out of the way first. I'm just gonna get you started there so that I can come up here and wire that. And I'm following the wire, and there's a fly on my finger. And I'm trying to keep the wire as close to the other wire as possible, just for a little bit of support. And I'm going to use these pliers to just kind of squeeze them together a little bit. Just going to squeeze them together a little bit. That's okay. And then I'm just going to cut this off there. Lovely. And then I'm going to finish wiring this branch. Goodness me. Leave me alone, would you? Okay. Okay. Alrighty. Okay. Okay. Great. And that's that. Great. So that can be moved. Now I'm just gonna wire up the rest of these guys. William, are there questions for me while we are doing this?
So we've got Jessica, who is in Wake Forest. She's asking about the hardiness zones that we should be looking for bonsai trees, given that they are potted over the winter.
So hardiness zones, I don't think about when it comes to bonsai trees. If it grows, just like if it's in your zone, it's in your zone. I don't know the range for Pinus thunbergii, but I know 8A or whatever we are now is certainly within the range. It's certainly hardy here. If you want to push hardiness zones because it's in a pot, you're like welcome to try, but just like keep in mind that over the winter, if you're overwintering it, it's not going to have as much light. It's not going to really like that. But like really pick things that are like perfectly hardy for you. Really common bonsai species are, Japanese maples. Those are very hardy here. Japanese black pine, very hardy here. I got some ginkgo biloba, also very hardy here. And there's no reason you have to use Japanese species. You can certainly use native species. You might have to like learn the character of the trees. For a while, I was growing our native Diospyros virginiana, the native persimmon. They didn't make it through that polar vortex we had 2 years ago. Go figure that. But if you pruned them this time of year, they basically didn't do a second flush of growth for me. I don't know if it was just me or if it was the species of tree. I also used to have Cercis canadensis that I tried growing as bonsai, and that kind of had the same thing. Like they just would not do a second flush of growth. And that doesn't mean you can't use it as a bonsai species. It's just you're gonna have to be mindful of the fact that it's not gonna flush again. Like you only get the one flush for the year, which isn't unusual for bonsai. Japanese white pine, Pinus parviflora, that's a single flush species as well, and you'll see those grown as bonsai all over the place. So there are ways to grow plants that only flush once, but you just need to be cognizant of perhaps their limitations. What else, William?
Yeah, and then Jared asks, so if I pronounce this correctly, Osmocote a good option for fertilizing bonsai? He mentions that he prefers a slow release, so he's not over fertilizing, but is wondering if that provides enough food for a tree growing in soilless media.
It can be argued it provides too much food for the tree. Osmocote is wonderful. It's a complete nutrient. It has all the nutrients that plants need, and in some pretty high percentages. And I had used it previously and it was fine. It's just a lot of growth, and it's more growth than you actually need. What I recommend for fertilizer for bonsai is like organic plant food, like plant tone, for example. That's a good one, because the organic stuff, it's a low grade. It's not as high a percentage of nitrogen and all that stuff like you have with Osmocote, and it's slow release too, and it contributes to the organic matter in the soil, which just helps the soil benefit, the soil health a lot. I had a conversation with somebody about the fertilizer that I used, and they responded, oh, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you're using a synthetic fertilizer, a high nitrogen synthetic fertilizer, it'll upset the fungal associations in the soil. Like your bonsai trees will get mycorrhizae in them. My pines generally do have mycorrhizae in them, and if you're using Osmocote, it's generally like way too much fertilizer for the fungus growing in the soil, and you won't have the fungus growing, which is not great. You want that fungus because the fungus helps pick up nutrients and stuff. But so I don't recommend Osmocote, but you certainly can use it, and you just need to be mindful of how much growth you're getting out of it, like how much you're applying to it, and maybe you need to apply just like a small amount of that slow release fertilizer. Yeah, for sure. Like it's an option, but you definitely want to develop an understanding of like plant nutrition and fertilizers generally if you're going to be doing that. What time is it, William?
It is 3:40.
Holy moly. Okay.
I know it.
Well, I wanted to wire this whole tree, but I'm not going to do that for the sake of time. But I will just kind of move some branches around. If I was going to wire the whole tree, boy, I would move I would wire every single branch. You do wire every single branch so that you can get it. You can move every branch where you need them to move. I'm just moving them kind of out of the way so that they can get sunshine. And yes. And I'll finish wiring this when I get home. But for the time being, this is great. I'm just spreading out the branches, letting them let in more light. And honestly, boy, do I wish I had all these branches wired right now. But that's okay. I bow before time. That's cute. Here, that's cute. And then I'll clean that up and I'll put more wire on it later. Obviously, just showing you how to get it on there. Just the idea, you want your parent wire, you wire your lowest branch, the second lowest branch, and you go up like that. And then you just always wire two branches together, and it builds upon each other. The wire on this branch is supported by this branch, and if you were to wire further branches, that wire would be supported by the wire that's on this branch, which is supported by the wire that's on this branch. So it just kind of goes back in that pattern like that, back to the beginning of time. One thing I did want to show you guys, I wanted to make sure I showed you, was how to take wire off of a tree, because there is a trick to this. You don't just grab it and start unwrapping it, because that would cause the wire to drag across the branch and kind of mess up the bark, and that is not good. So the trick to it is you rotate the pliers in your hand while you're unwiring it. So I'm going to grab this, I'm going to grab it like that, and I'm going to spin it in my hand while I spin the wire around the branch, and the branch or the wire just lifts off and comes with me. It doesn't drag, it doesn't scar. We're twirling it, and we're holding the wire while it's on the tree and while we're pulling it off. And we're being gentle and careful and thoughtful. And if it's your tree, you don't have to be as gentle and careful and thoughtful as if it were somebody else's. But it's always nice to be nice to trees. So we're gonna do it right. And you can see the wire was cutting in there a little bit. That's the main consideration about wire. This is not really the time of year to wire your trees because the trees are in active growth and you're gonna get wire digging into trees a lot sooner this time of year. So I have to watch this guy a lot and make sure the wire doesn't bite into the branches or else that's going to be an issue. And I'll just want to pull that off as soon as I possibly can. The best time to wire is in the autumn, which if you watched part 1, you already knew that. You put wire on in the autumn and then it's not in active growth. The branch has time to set over winter before it starts growing, before the wire starts digging into it. And then in springtime, you can take the wire off, hasn't bitten in, and the branch is set. But I just wanted to show you that. Show you how to unwire. Okay, and I did have one thing planned, and I really don't think I'm gonna get through the whole thing, but this here is a bunch of Acer Virginianum. This is trident maple. This is a forest of trident maples. It's a forest planting. As a matter of fact, I put that in that pot this spring. This was the pot that it was in before this whole thing, and it was very, very root bound in there. It was hilarious how many roots I had to cut off this thing to get it into this little pot. But sure enough, I got it into this little pot, and sure enough, it did leaf out vigorously when it did that. One thing, however, this tree here, this one on the front here, he's got some dead on him. He's a little bit weak. I'd say all of these trees are pretty darn strong, but this one is a little bit weak. So my hope was to defoliate this entire tree. I was gonna leave the weak one because it's a stress defoliating the tree. If the trees are strong, it helps speed along its growth. After you defoliate it, it'll put out a whole new flush of growth, and it's basically like putting fast forward on the year. Like you'll get a couple seasons of growth in a single growing season by defoliating it. June again is the earliest you want to do this. It's had time to grow, it's had time to settle and get set. And you can do this now, and then you can even do it again in a few months. I'd say maybe don't defoliate them more than twice in a year. And you can do this to maples. Obviously don't defoliate your pines. Your pines, you gotta leave needles on there because they don't have latent buds, and you just have to leave green on pines and junipers, any sort of evergreen species like that. The conifers, really, you don't defoliate. But as far as and you may want to play around with them. Some species maybe you can defoliate, some species you can't. And again, only on vigorous. I say you can absolutely defoliate trident maple, but you can also absolutely kill a trident maple by defoliating if it's not happy and healthy. So really, all there is to this, actually, and pro tip, when you defoliate, when you do any sort of work on a bonsai tree generally, you can put a towel around the base of your tree, and that kind of helps with cleanup a little bit. So I'm just gonna start stripping leaves off of this thing. William, if you will get us going on some questions while I do this.
Awesome. And yes, if you have any questions, please just drop them in the chat here and we will get to them. Jared asks, what do you use for your soil? He's never actually bought Akadama, but he's heard that it's the best option. He currently is using a mixture of Napa Floor Dry and pine bark with pretty good success, he says.
Okay, so Akadama is hilarious. It's red clay, it's Japanese red clay. You will spend a preposterous amount of money for a tiny little bag of it. And I personally believe that it's really no different than Turfus, which is it's a component, it's what baseball infields are lined with. In part 1, I go into great depth with my bonsai substrate, but in short, my substrate is, chicken grit, which is basically a quarter inch gravel. And then I use Turfus, which is what they use baseball fields, used to line baseball fields, because it's a clay product that holds nutrients like clay, but it drains like rock, which is what Akadama does fundamentally, but you can get Turfus for way cheaper than you can get Akadama. And I will say, when I was in Japan, the substrate we used to grow, you know, the 50 to 100-year-old bonsai trees we were growing, it was straight gravel, just 1/4 inch crushed gravel. For fertilizer there, we used like an organic fertilizer. It was crushed canola seeds that we kind of broke into little cakes, and then you just put you dot the little cakes on top, and then it's just like an organic slow release fertilizer over time. That's how you can grow. That's how you get the nutrients while growing in straight rock. But so like your bonsai soil doesn't have to be any fancier than crushed granite if you are aware of the nutrients that requires. And I'll also say that Espoma makes bonsai soil that is perfectly reasonable. I will warn you away from using like peat-based substrates, because they hold just entirely too much water, and you really need to be able to water frequently to help regulate the temperature in the pot so the roots don't get too hot, and just all that other good stuff. So yeah, I hope that if you want to hear more about soils, check out the part 1 of this, and the recording is on YouTube, and I go a little bit more in depth in that while I show how to repot trees.
And Catherine put it right there in the chat for anybody that wants to check it out.
Awesome. Thank you, Catherine.
You mentioned your use of gravel. Do you have a layer of gravel around the perimeter of every single one of your pots? And if so, why?
So I don't have a layer of gravel anywhere near any one of my pots. Like, it is mixed into the substrate. I'm not top dressing or anything like that. Like, it is the substrate. So it's yeah, there's no, I don't decorate with it. I guess you could decorate with gravel, but I don't see the point when it's the substrate itself, really. So yeah, I don't know. Just a layer of gravel around.
That's what was asked.
Okay. Yeah. I think I answered that question.
I think so too.
Okay.
Yes, and if there are any other questions, just drop them right here in the chat and we will get to them. But for now, that's all.
For now, that's all. How are we doing on time?
It is 3:51.
3:51. Okay. So we'll just keep rolling with this for a little bit. You know, it's so funny whenever you're doing this not on camera, I feel like I go like way faster with this, but it's been a while since I have defoliated this tree. And I just want to do that. I just want you guys to see that, like, yeah, like, just take them all off. You can go through with scissors and do this piece by piece, but like, you can also really just strip the whole thing away. And I'm being sloppy and I'm missing things because, like, you know, I'm very distracted and, you know, pressed for time. But so like, you literally want to pull off every single leaf. And yeah, and I know like you don't want to pull off every single leaf, but it does help things. And like, leaving leaves on doesn't really do anything for what we're doing here, and it does reflush when you remove everything.
You briefly mentioned talking about native genus in bonsais. Do you have a personal opinion on what the best native genus or species for bonsai, at least in this area?
The best native species for bonsai. So my opinion is that all plants are wonderful, and there's no best. There's no best. There are ones that make you excited, ones that you are partial for, but there's good stuff everywhere. I mean, red maple, Acer rubrum does okay. It doesn't love, you know, urban environments, but it can handle the stress. If you've ever been out to the North Carolina Arboretum out in Asheville, they have a lovely bonsai collection that I highly recommend. And that is, in fact, the bonsai collection that sort of set me on the horticultural path and also opened my eyes to nature at all. And they've got quite a few red maples that are absolutely delightful. And I like maples a lot. Maples are really forgiving, as you can literally strip all of the leaves off of a maple tree and it'll just regrow. And they're really forgiving in that sense. You can, like, honestly, you can cut off just the whole top chunk and it'll just resprout. Maples are wonderful trees for beginners because they are so forgiving and useful. But I mean, other native species that are good for bonsai. I've seen people use loblolly pine. It's not the prettiest tree. It's not the ugliest tree either, but it's another one that's just like super, super resilient, can take a real beating, all sorts of abuse, and it'll still keep on growing. So that's a good one.
Carolyn specifically asks about broadleaf evergreens. Do you think that they would be suitable for bonsai?
Broadleaf evergreens are absolutely suitable for bonsai. Camellias in particular are one really commonly used species in Japan, and they're wonderful because they have flowers in the wintertime, which is great. And you can do it not just with Camellia japonicas, but like sasanquas and all sorts of other weird random camellia cultivars. I do recommend camellias. You can certainly do boxwoods if you're into that kind of thing. They don't have flowers, but they do have nice form. You can do hollies, ilexes, all sorts of, oh dude, you can do Elaeagnus pungens. That's right. Ugly Agnes is one of the common names for Elaeagnus, but I'll tell you, if you give Ugly Agnes the respect and care and attention that she deserves, goodness me, is she gorgeous. The silver underneath, just the character of the foliage, and yeah, that one's, yeah, people really don't like that tree in the landscape, but if you have a nice, healthy bonsai specimen, and they get little berries on them too, like it's seriously very, very beautiful. Highly recommend Elaeagnus, amongst other broadleaf evergreens, for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah. And we
are coming up on the last 5 minutes today.
That's amazing.
It is 3:50.
That's amazing.
I want to say thank you to Blake for showing us all of his excellent bonsai trees and sharing his wonderful bonsai knowledge.
Yeah, and thank you everybody for being here with me and just, watching me do some of my chores for the year, I guess, is really what I'm doing. I would love to, and I will, finish getting all of these leaves off of this, but I certainly don't want to keep you all waiting for too long. So we'll go ahead and just kind of get pruning on it. And again, once you've defoliated it, you can go ahead and prune. And it's the same concept as with the crepe myrtle, where you gotta pick a top, and then that's your top. And so like with this guy here, I guess this little node right here is the top that it's gonna be, and I'll just get that off. And then everything else, I'm gonna go in and cut back to 1 or 2 nodes, mostly 1. This guy's been, in the recording, I'll be able to post a picture of, if not this particular forest planting, a forest planting that I did very similar to this many years ago after defoliating, and I can show what it looked like before and then after defoliating and then it flushing out again, because it really is fun to see them. Like if you've never seen somebody defoliate an entire tree, and gosh, this planting's gotta be, it's at least 10 years old anymore. We started these as maybe 1 or 2 year saplings with my American bonsai teacher back in like 2012 when I first got started. So this is a rather old planting anymore, and I've been doing this thing to this for, obviously the summer I was in Japan, I didn't do it that year, but for years and years since then, and just kind of cutting it to shape. Another fun thing about bonsai is basically basically all bonsai trees kind of look the same, like their canopy. They all kind of have this same shape, and that's just because you're following the rules of making sure that there's light getting to every single branch. When you cut every single branch such that light gets to it, it just naturally rounds out the whole thing, and you can see everything, and they all kind of look the same. And like, maybe that's boring artistically speaking, or maybe it's absolutely incredible that nature can do that, where there's just these rules and just these emergent patterns that kind of appear out of, you just follow these simple little rules and these patterns emerge, and I don't know, it's cool. But so I'm actually getting pretty close. Oh, and that one that I said that I wasn't going to defoliate, I totally defoliated it. That's hilarious. It'll be okay. It'll be okay. One thing, this planting has 7 trees in it because 7 is a beautiful and lucky number. I'll tell you, 4 is atrocious. That's one of the worst numbers in the history of the world. There's the Chinese word for 4 and the Chinese word for death are like the same thing. So you avoid 4. 6 is pretty bad too.
But 7?
7's beautiful. Your number. 5's beautiful. 3's beautiful. Prime numbers generally are great. And then just, I mean, whatever numbers feel good to you. What's your favorite number, William? I know you want to be a high school math teacher. What's your favorite number?
I don't know. I sort of aim towards 15.
15. Interesting. Okay. Well, William, if you ever want to have a forest planting with 15 trees, I say go for it.
Sounds great. Thank you, Blake.
I say go for it. But I mean, okay, like I said, I can go in there and pull out the rest of them. But for now, we'll just end things there. Cute little tree. It'll come in eventually. So thank you.
Thank you, Blake. Once again, thank you all for joining us this week on our midweek program. Looking ahead, we've got what makes our Japanese garden special with our director, Mark Wethington, and director of horticulture, Greg Page, for next week's midweek. So thank you guys again for joining us. Thank you for Blake. And yeah, we'll end it there. Thank you guys.
We'll see y'all next week. Y'all take care.
Yep.